Okay, well, thank you again, everybody, for joining. This is the Dallas Salesforce Developer User Group. Everybody in the right place? Oh, okay. Everybody here? Let's see. There we go. Looking forward to talking with MVP Eric Smith. And Eric, I know you from contributions on UnofficialSF.
Yeah.
I think that's where I found your stuff. I was like, okay, I'm a fan. So we'll have to talk about that. We'll get into that in a second. Really quickly, I'm Paul McCollum. Here's my contact information. Run the group founded by Moyez on the call also tonight. We have three people here. Renee Bartel is helping me. She is one of our Stack champions. Feel free to hop in on the social for us. I don't have a custom Twitter QR for us tonight. I'm sorry, I'm falling down on my only pizzazz element. But as with Stack champions, if anybody is looking to own a topic and help drive content into this user group, these are our leaders that are helping do those things. So Moyez with the nonprofit stand-up, machine learning and AI, Renee, LWC and JavaScript, Nathan Schulman. Flows is where I keep bringing stuff in, and Waka's Nasir, which he may be permanently absent. I think his company is getting happily acquired. So he may be busy or he may be on a beach. So we'll see. I'm very happy for him, but I've missed him here doing our security touch base every month. That was neat for a while. We've already been hearing from Moyez, unless you had anything else to announce, Moyez. And just a teaser for next month, we'll talk DevOps. This is the session we dreamed up the other night, why you shouldn't hate DevOps. Right-size your DevOps practices. So I've been working with Vernon to try and talk through a presentation to not feel like DevOps is causing you to do extra work and understand why it's there. I still hate it. It still feels like a lot of administrivia to me. And I'm hoping he can shed some light on why we should appreciate it and embrace it. So that'll be next month. But for this month, I will quickly, Renee, do you have anything for us that you want to talk to? Cool. Me too. All right, Eric. Would love to hear you introduce yourself and have a little background, at least more than I've done, with just the one-liner of how I know you and what made me reach out. You should have the ability to take over and start sharing screen.
I will do that in a moment. We'll try and keep it fairly informal tonight. First of all, I realize this is the developers group, but I don't work as a developer. But I've been in technology for over 45 years now. When I first started out, I actually did some programming, had my own IT company, sold personal computers, and actually was involved with the same franchise business as Mark Cuban, and met him a few times early on in Dallas before he went on and did a few things a bit different than what he's doing now. But I had my own PC business for about 25 years. Worked in sales, worked in project management, worked for a telecommunications company, and currently I work for a Salesforce consulting partner as a technical architect. As Paul mentioned, I have been a contributor on UnofficialSF. I consider myself kind of a curious person, but also a lazy person at times. If Salesforce doesn't do something, I try and find a way to make it happen. But when I do make it happen, I don't want to have to reproduce or redo my work later on down the road. So my whole emphasis has been on, if I'm going to create something to do something, I want to make sure it's going to be reusable. And not just for myself, but by putting it out there as open source out there to the community to make sure other people can take advantage of, the effort and the time that went into developing some of these components. We've got a fair number of them out there. Probably the most widely used one now is a data table component for flow screens. Last time I checked, it's been installed in over 60,000 orgs. There was a discussion today on the Release Readiness Live for Flow as to when the standard component that Salesforce has come out with is going to be kind of in par with what the UnofficialSF component does, and basically the answer was it's going to take quite some time. But I have been in touch from time to time with the product managers there and tossed ideas back and forth, and they are bringing their product along as well. But one of the real interesting things they've been doing, and I've been involved with this since the very first initial beta and pilots they had, which is reactive screen components. And let me share my screen. I just want to show a few examples of what can be done with reactive screen components. So let me move this off of there and share and slideshow. So hopefully you see a title slide there, reactive screen components, or am I showing the wrong screen?
Yes, we see it.
Oh, perfect. So
I went on mute, so you couldn't hear me eat pizza.
Okay, well, that's fine. Reactive Flow screen components are kind of interesting in that they allow you to now do what we call a single screen solution. In the past, if you wanted to get input from a user and process some of that input and then pass it on to another component, you had to go from screen to screen to screen to do it, because Salesforce Flow would just take a snapshot, one process at a time. It would take the information it had, and you were able to then do things with that in the flow. But then in order to go back and interact with the user again on the screen, you had to go to a new screen, a new component. So there's a lot of effort that's being pushed back to the user to make them determine when they're done on a screen, when they have to click next, when they go forward, when they go backwards. And by being able to do a reactive screen components, we take a lot of that away. And as a designer and a developer, you can really build things around a single screen or a single presentation of that user. And by letting the components interact with each other, you can, I think, provide a much cleaner and easier to use experience for your users. And I just want to show a few examples of how we can do that. So bear with me a moment while I step away from the slideshow and find another screen to look at here. I'm going to just show a couple flows that use reactive screen components. This is one that uses my data table component and another component that does a SQL query, goes out and gets records and then comes back and presents them. So at this point, it's probably going to make me log in again. So apologize for the delay. Okay. All demos work perfectly the first time through. So let me see here.
Can you zoom in some? Because that's rather small for me.
I will, yes, I will zoom in as soon as I get this back.
It looked like classic. I don't want to see that again.
I don't either. That was pretty ugly, wasn't it?
Ugh. Make it stop.
Wow. So let's try and. Well, this is
Everybody on the call should have the ability to speak up. I was hoping for this to be
Salesforce is not behaving at the moment. Let's see.
largely interactive. So
I'm a firm believer that this happens anytime.
yeah, the chicken sacrifice. I saw the wine, but
Okay.
demo gods.
So I am going to run a flow here if this org decides to behave. This is a GS0 org, so it's kind of, it can be a little buggy at times. Let me scroll in a bit. Is that a little better on the screen? Can people see that?
A little better, yeah.
Okay. So what I have here is a simple example where I have a list of accounts, And once I have the user select an account, I want to be able to show a list of contacts that are associated with that account. And previously in Flow, before you had reactive components, you had to select an account on one screen, then to go out and do a get records to get contacts related to that account, and then you could display or interact with those contacts on a second screen. And with this, what we're doing is we are having the selection of one component pass data into the second component, which then on that same screen can say, okay, you have selected this Acme account. Here are all the contacts that are related to that account. If I select a different account, it's going to show me a different list of contacts. And as we keep switching accounts, that second data table is going to show a whole different set of records. So we have a component that's kind of in between these two data tables that is going out and saying, okay, I know what the account is. I'm going to go and get all the contacts with it. So now that I have all those contacts, I'm going to tell the next data table on the screen that here are the contacts I want you to display. And I'll just show you the actual flow itself that's driving this. It's a single screen. I start with getting my accounts. And then on the screen, I have two data tables and a component I call this data fetcher. So the data table for account is saying just take the accounts that we have gotten with our get accounts, display those accounts. I'm selecting a single row from that, and then the output from that data table is being passed into this data fetcher component with a formula that has a query string, and I'll show you that in a moment. And then the second data table is taking the output from that data fetcher right here and saying these records that I got with the data fetcher, those are my input to this second data table. And taking a look at that formula that I have for the query, it's just a SOQL query. I'm saying just select these fields from the contact record where the account ID is equal to the account ID that came from the selected row in the data table component that's also on that same screen. So these three components are really interacting with each other. And by having this reactivity, we're able to have them update themselves in real time on a single screen. Another example of that, and let's see if we can do this without going back to classic view, is a quick choice component, which is also on UnofficialSF. The quick choice is kind of a pick list component on steroids. It gives you the ability to do radio buttons, pick list, visual cards, a few other things, to take a collection or a pick list field and display values. And the power in this particular component is, unlike the original pick list component provided standard with the flow, this component allowed you to specify a record type. And then once you had a record type, you were only going to display those pick list values associated with that record type. And now I've gone and extended this a little further and said, well, not only am I going to be able to pass in a record type to this pick list component called quick choice, I'm also going to pass in a controlling value. If it's a dependent pick list, being able to pass in a controlling value and specify what that controlling value is. So when we run this particular component, if there's a controlling value from one pick list field, here I have a pick list for fruit, and then I have a dependent pick list that, depending upon what fruit I've selected, it's going to give me some options for color. So if I then go and change the selection for the produce, I get a different selection of options for color. And this is actually two separate pick list components on the same screen, with the output from one being passed into the second one, saying this is the dependent value that you're going to use to then give me the pick list options that we're going to display for that second pick list. So that's a couple examples there. The third example I want to show you, we can actually look at the code for this as well, for those that are interested. And this is one that I created. I wanted to just create a couple components from scratch and have them talk to each other. So I came up with a couple components for this particular flow that I call the concentration or memory gain. And what this does is I have one component that displays a card. And that card can either be the back of the card, the front of the card, or it can be blank. And then I have a second component, which is I call it the game controller. And this is keeping track of what all the other cards are doing. So it knows what's been selected, what's not been selected, and passes the value back to each individual card to say, based on what you've selected so far, here's what you have to show, the front, the back, or something blank. So if I click on one of these, it's going to show me a symbol. If I click on another one, if they don't match, it flips them back over. If I click on two cards and they do match, it clears them off, and I continue on with my selections until I try and get all of these matched up. Wow, I'm going to have probably a record result here. Usually it takes me about 20 tries to get all of these right. Oh, I missed one. There we go. And when we click the last pair, we get the Salesforce confetti to display as well. So this particular example is these components are standalone components, but they're smart enough so they can talk to each other and pass that information back and forth. And all of this is done on just a single flow screen in Salesforce. And basically what I have is I have my 12 individual cards. It's the same card component. And I'm just passing in some information about the game itself. And then these components pass back to my controller a code from each of the cards as to whether it's been exposed or not, turned over, turned back, or blank. And they just talk back and forth with each other, passing this information back and forth in order to play this memory game.
Where's the controller logic? Did you show that already?
The controller here, this is basically taking the information from each of these cards and saying, each time I click on a card, it's sending its information to the controller. It says, okay, you've clicked on it. Now what do I do with that information? So it has these 12 cards that gets passed back into the controller. And then if we look at the code,
okay.
What I have, and the card itself is pretty straightforward. Let me see if I can zoom in on this for you. Let's see.
The cards are elements on the screen, but all of the interaction between the cards are. Okay.
Yeah. So, all right, who can tell me real quick, how do you zoom in VS Code? I don't see it here. Oh, here we go. Control plus.
You should be able to hold control and mouse wheel as well.
Yeah, I tried that and it wasn't working. So here we go.
Oh.
So the cards themselves is just basically just displaying the back, the front, or a blank image. And the handler for those cards is basically taking deciding what to do based on what's coming back and forth from the controller. So the controller sends information into the cards, and based on the information coming from the controller, this is where and anytime something gets passed in as a reactive component, the get set for that attribute, the set for the attribute is where the processing happens, saying, oh, I got a new value, I'm going to do something with it. So this is where that's happening in this particular component. Says I'm getting an ID from the controller, now I'm deciding what I'm going to do with that. And the rest of the component is basically, there's a couple things here where I've taken the information from the controller to say, this is the random order we're going to put the cards, and this is the set of images that we're going to display for these cards. And it's different every time. I've got like 30 or so images out there. I only put 6 at a time into the game. So each time somebody plays it, it's a different set of images. But this is the information that's passed back in from the controller that basically tells the card, here's your image you're going to display. And the controller is saying, what am I going to do with that? Front, back, or blank. And then the controller is basically when anytime a card is clicked, it's the inputs here. If a particular card is clicked, I just get the information saying this card was clicked, and it passes it to this handler to say, now I need to do an update on this. Is this the first card that was clicked? Is it the second card that was clicked? Do they match? Do they don't match? And then I send the information back to the Flow engine, which then shares it with the other components on the screen, and they take that information and decide what to do with it. It's pretty straightforward. This is, I put this out there. I think I put this, yes, it's on UnofficialSF. So if you look for the concentration game or reactive screen components on UnofficialSF, there's a link to the source code. And I've tried to document this as well as to what each step is doing and where I'm doing that processing, where I'm handling the reactivity for these components. There's basically just a few key points to keep in mind when you're creating a component that needs to be reactive. And I'm going to switch back to my presentation and we'll step through those. If I find the right screen. There we go. There's basically three key points. One is you do not update any of your API attributes. In other words, the exposed attributes, you don't update them directly in your components. You use a getter and a setter and then a local variable internally within the component that takes and handles the updates. The setter for each of your input attributes is what you need to use to trigger any handling your component needs to do to react to any time one of those values changes. So a value gets passed in, the setter for that attribute then says, oh, I got a new value. I'm going to decide now what I want to go and do with that value. And then anytime you change a value in your component that you want to then go out and share with the rest of the components that are running in that flow, you basically need to make sure that when you set a new value for an attribute, you dispatch an event. This is a standard event that you bring into your components, the flow attribute change event, and you dispatch that event with a new value. It goes back to the flow engine so the other components know what that change is and can react to it. So very simply, the not updating the API attributes directly using that getter and setter and doing things in the setter, this is the basic pattern that you follow. You have an attribute that's exposed in your component, and you basically have a getter and a setter for it that uses just a local variable to process those values. But in that setter that's where you do any of your processing when that value changes. You call your handlers, you do your other things based on a change in that value. And then in your component, where you're handling different things, you're doing different things. If you're setting an attribute that's an output attribute for that component, you just need to dispatch that change back out to the flow engine. And I'm doing this here. I just have a handler to say, I've changed an attribute, the name of the attribute, the value, and this is the standard format here that you use to send the information back out to the flow. Very simple pattern. It gets a little trickier when you put it all together, but those are the primary things you really need to be aware of when you are trying to make these components for a flow screen be reactive. There are some really good resources out there, and I'll leave this on here for a little bit. There's a couple QR codes. There's a whole trail mix that has references to a lot of different articles and other information about how to work with reactive components. It has a link to the Trailblazer community for the reactive component group. I've posted a number of these things there. There's a lot of other interaction that goes on with the product managers directly from Salesforce on this. So it's a really good resource there as well. So if you click on this link here for the trail mix, you need to log into your own Trailhead account. and you'll be taken to the trail mix, which has the links for all of these other components as well. And this particular article here, this Learn More, Adam White put this together recently, and I'll show you that page.
Can I ask a couple of questions about the memory game?
Yes.
So with the promise of reactive flow components, I was expecting to see a lot of flow WYSIWYG stuff and not hop straight to LWC. Can you talk me through where the transition is, or what is a reactive flow component doing, and how much LWC do you have to write to be able to use reactive components?
Well, that's kind of interesting. You really don't, because the standard components are being designed and enhanced over time to become reactive themselves. So in the example in this particular article here, I'm trying to see if he shows that this flow right here is using primarily standard components. We're inputting some currency values. We're using a standard slider to pick a number. There's a number input component here, and then there's a reactive formula that is being used based on the interest rate, the loan term, and these dollar amounts. A reactive formula is running this calculation. So the reactivity is in standard components, and you can also enhance that or supplement that with custom components. So what I was showing earlier was saying, well, here's how in a custom component you can build in that reactivity, which it's fairly straightforward. There's only a few different things to keep in mind. The flow engine takes care of everything else. Not all components, standard components yet, are reactive, and the trail mix has some articles on which ones are, which ones aren't, and what the roadmap's going to be for those. One example is this right here, where it's displaying the payment. That's a custom component there because the display text component is not yet reactive.
Okay.
All the other components you see in this particular example right here are standard components that are reactive, so they know inputs and output what the values of the other ones are.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah. And here's just another example of something very similar. Any other questions? Or any desire to see how the reactivity was done in some of the other components like the data table or the quick choice?
What about the data volume? Like as we have seen some of the components, right? Like a contacts, when you are trying to show up the related contacts or something, right? So is there any limitation on that?
Any limitation on that?
On the
Like
data
number
side?
of records, limits on the.
Oh, yes. I was using data table to display the records, so I have currently a hard-coded limit of 2,000 records that will be displayed at one time. The standard data table component, I think, is 1,500 records. So that's the only limitation there. The other limitation you have is the component that was used to query the contact object and get the contact records related to the account. If you had an org, for example, that had a few million accounts, and you were trying to write a SQL query against that org to get, say a few million contacts, I'm sorry. If you're trying to do a query that wasn't restrictive enough, you might get kickback from Salesforce saying, I can't query that many records unless you provide me different attributes or looking at different fields, for example.
And that's your data table extension, isn't it? Did you wrote the data tables for UnofficialSF?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's who you're talking to. The
Yeah.
guy that did data tables before Salesforce did data tables and flows.
Well, the lookup component was before they did the lookup component and a few other ones too. But yeah, that the data table, that's just an example of something. I got so tired of dealing with dynamic record choice and trying to display a list of records when you could only have one field be displayed by a dynamic record choice. And I said, there's got to be a better way of doing it. And that's where I stumbled across the data table component. I said, well, that's a way I can organize my data, make it look better. And I originally developed it as an Aura component. And then the Aura components, you had to hard code the object that you were going to be using in the data table. So I created a version that had like 10 standard objects in it. If you weren't using one of those, well, you had to go in and change the code. And then they finally came out with Lightning Web Components and the ability to specify the object at runtime or at the time you configure the component. And that's when I said, well, I better redo this whole thing as a Lightning Web Component. And then eventually they came out with custom property editors, and that's where it became much easier and cleaner to configure the component by being able to have control over how you interacted with the user when they were actually putting in their attributes and configuring the component. But yeah, that was me being stubborn, saying there's got to be a better way than dynamic record choice. And I had a few use cases for it. I put it out there, and it's been amazing, just amazing the number of use cases that people have come up with for this. And based on their feedback, I've been able to add a lot of enhancements and other things to it to meet a lot of other use cases far beyond what my original ideas and plans were.
That's one of my first Aura projects that I did for Dreamforce. Was I basically made a multiplayer version of that and kind of shaped it around reserving a seat and kept everybody's screen updating. Each player was reaching out for updates real time, and it was updating the screen on whatever everybody else chose, so that you knew you could do shifts, stuff like that, picking seats in a classroom and have seats real time disappear.
Oh, that's neat.
Yeah, the single page app in Salesforce, it's been some of the lazy load stuff for Lightning experience has been cool, but I'm still waiting for more of that in-page functionality like that.
Right. Yeah, it's this one that they're putting a lot of effort into it, and we're going to see more and more capability as each release comes through on this. So if you haven't experimented with these yet, I recommend giving them a try, joining the Trailblazer community group for that, seeing some interesting examples and trying to put some of these together for yourself. So
there's a community group for Reactive Components?
Yes, there is. And
okay.
Let me it is right here. This is the trail mix.
Okay.
So it has that learn more article, the link to the community, some documentation articles. There's a playback of a session that Diana Jaffe and Adam White did at DX this year on Reactive Components, and then a few other articles as well that are very helpful. But the community group, let me link to that.
And there's a hand up. We did have a request to look more at data tables, and there's a hand up. So if you can speak, please feel free to go ahead and speak.
All right. Again here, Sam. So how about like if anything goes wrong, like as part of this process, I'm trying to run this flow and then I'm seeing some error. We right now have the option like debugging, right? So when we are turning, like trying to run this in the debugger, so are we get all the information like in a normal flow, like where it is failing, what data it's came in?
No, you don't. And that is on the roadmap as well. And that's a very important consideration. I was talking with Adam the other day, and that was one of the things we were discussing. He was saying that you don't have the ability in the debugger right now to know really what's going on while all this interaction is going on. So they are planning on really enhancing what you can do in the Flow debugger, so you can see more behind the scenes of how these components are interacting, where the data is, what's being passed back and forth between them. So right now, the only way you're going to see any of that would be if you had custom components you were using and you had console log statements in there or other things that you could look at while the component was executing to see what was happening. But this is something that is in the plans for the enhancing the standard debug capability for flows.
All right. Yeah. Thank you.
Yep.
Wondering if you could go through the data table you built.
Sure.
And
What-
just to kind of share, I am hoping to build an amortization table, active screen components, like a pricing model based on the amortization table.
Okay.
Eventually.
Okay. And how are you thinking of using data table with that?
So my company had originally wanted all 480 months
Yep.
to be completely generated when they
Okay.
enter a pricing model,
Yep.
which I thought might be massive overkill. But I wasn't sure if the data table would be something we could use.
Now, would those be actual records in an object that would have that amortization data, or would that be something you would build on the fly and then want to display formatted on the screen?
Build on the fly and display it
Okay.
formatted on the screen, and then maybe save as a like PDF later, but that's way advanced.
Yep. Well, what you can do, you can build things on the fly, and I have a link here under additional resources. If you go to the data table page on UnofficialSF, and that's how to use Apex defined objects with the data tables. In other words, creating records on the fly or creating custom records that really aren't part of any object, but using the data table to format that and display it on the screen. And there's a couple ways that you can do that. And one is you can actually create your own Apex defined object and pass that into the data table, or better yet, and what I've done for static tables or just tables that have these one-time uses, I just build it on the fly. And all you need to do is to be able to create in your flow a long string of all your values in this format that you see right here, pass that into the data table, and it will then display that in a formatted fashion for you. So it's basically saying, you have these records separated by commas, and you say, this is the name of the field, this is the value, field value, field value. You build out your records in your flow, pass that string that you've built into the data table, and it will format it all and display it for you.
Any memory limits on the size of the string that can be passed to data table besides the web HTML? What is it, 2
I
megs?
think it playing with strings and flows, as I'm creating a utility to analyze flows right now, and I was passing flow metadata back and forth into the utility, and I came up with a limit. I think it was 700,000 characters, roughly. So it's pretty big.
Thank you.
And the other thing you could do, and this is an interesting way of doing it, and I've done this in flows before, is I've created a custom object that has the fields that I want, but I never put any data into the custom object in Salesforce. I build records in the flow, and I create these collections of records in my flow around this custom object, use the data table, do other things in the flow with all of those records, but when the flow is done, those records are gone. I display them, I interact with them, I do things with them, but I never do a update records or a create records and put them out into Salesforce. So that's another option. You could create a custom object that says, this is what a single amortization line is going to look like. Here are the fields. You just build all those records in your flow. just send a collection of records into the data table, let it display it, let them interact with it. But you never have to save it.
Yeah, and if you don't pause, heap size limits that you run into with trying to do that, that's one of the 3 reasons I ever say you probably don't want to do this with a flow, and there's only 2 now. Large in-memory mapping, basically doing building lookup tables within memory and being able to do map finds is one of the places that I say don't, just because.
Yeah, because you can't do maps in Flow. And that's one of the challenges. There's really no map capability.
That too, yeah.
Have you hit limits trying to do this?
Well, no, it's just if that's one I would stay away from. If I ever thought I was pulling up large tables of data to do multiple matching lookups or have that be on screen or one of the steps, because of the limits I've hit have been due to having too many records in memory and trying to pause the flow or exit the flow, and then not be able, because it can't do save state.
All right.
I don't usually do that. I usually expect flows to be ephemeral. I don't like saving flows and resuming them later, but since that ends up being a part, calling subflows, I think, temporarily pauses a flow sometimes, but all speculation. I've just tried to come up with a practice expectation around it, because I'm usually the guy saying don't do that in Apex, we can do it in flows. And there's 2 reasons left that I don't do.
In that type of situation, I think you really do probably want to be committing records out there to an object and dealing with them that way. And you don't have to save them; they can be deleted later. But yes, trying to keep that all in memory can be a challenge. The other thing, and this is interesting too, is and I've done this a lot to try and reduce the complexity of flows and get rid of loops, is on UnofficialSF, you have a whole collection of these little mini Apex components, invocable actions that are out there, and they're called the collection processors. And they're designed to work with collections of records, things that you would normally do in a loop, that if you use one of these collection processors instead, you're kind of making a hybrid of Flow and Apex, and say, let Apex do the heavy lifting, process all these records, handle my collections, and let the Flow just be the traffic cop and guide things along. And this is a really good, I think, really good pattern to follow when you do get into some of those larger or more complex automation situations, is being able to do that hybrid model where say, okay, I can do a lot with Flow, but when it comes with looping through records and sorting and filtering and mapping and all of that, just let Apex do that. And these are all very generic, simple, invocable actions where Apex is doing the dirty work and you're just sending the collections back and forth to your Flow.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, I was hoping, and specifically around the amortization table topic, that Salesforce functions would be the place to farm out heavy crunch activities and bring back the results. Since they already have a lot of Java libraries out there that you could borrow to do amortization tables, and then not have to worry about Apex limits.
When you get into some of the extra functionality that you're trying to do with something like that, Flow can be a little limiting. I mean, even today in the session, Adam mentioned that the exponential function is not reactive yet for Flow, and that's obviously something you need to be able to process exponents if you're going to be doing amortization tables. But there are certain things that you just need to step outside of Flow for. I actually did believe it or not, I made Flow do it, but I actually created a Flow years ago that did IP address mapping. And I worked for a telco company, and we had to find blocks of available IP addresses to allocate, and basically had Flow do the mathematics and the heavy lifting for IP addressing, which without a lot of numeric functionality and flow, that got to be a fairly tricky process, but was finally able to make it happen.
Yep. I forced Flow to do infinite records by using the platform events. I created a recursive flow pattern.
Yeah.
And have made it process. I think 1.5 million records is the most that I've seen one of the infinite flows process.
Before it blew up on you?
Huh? Did what blow up?
I said, did we got to that many records that it finally blow up on you, or?
No, it did the entire job, did all the calculations for opportunity line items up to opportunities. It went all the way. It'll keep going. It's event triggered flows emit events to run themselves again.
Yeah.
And so it just keeps calling. If you bite off a small number of records at a time that you can do in a single instance, and if you don't get done, you save your place somewhere by writing a record, emit an event, quit the flow, but the event is the same event that started the flow and calls the flow again, and it picks up where the last flow left off. And so just continues to process records in a batch until it runs out of records, and then you don't emit another event.
Did you write a blog post on that?
Did I write a what?
Did you write a blog post or an article on that?
I posted it on Automation Hour, presented it at Midwest Dreaming.
Okay.
And the presentation, I did present it here, so it's on YouTube.
Okay, because I think I've seen that. Maybe I saw it on Automation Hour. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
That's an interesting concept.
It's UnofficialSF is where all of these cool.
That was called collection process.
Yes, if you go to the UnofficialSF homepage and click on Flow, you're going to come to this first section here, installable screen components, actions, and base packs. If you select actions, it'll take you to a list of all of individual invocable actions for Flow, but there's also a link right here for that collection processing action package, and it lists what all of the various actions are in that group of collection processing actions. You install it just as one package and you get them all. Now, I find this one right here, find common and uncommon records in a collection, is to be one of the most powerful ones there. It basically allows you to take two collections, and they don't even have to be the same object. You can say, take this collection as my source, this collection as my target, and here's a field I want you to compare between the two, and it will return 4 collections. All of the records that are unique to the source, all of the records that are, I think, unique to the source, unique to the target, common in the source, and common in the target.
Is that basically a select distinct from tables?
Yep. And
I
use that all over the place.
Wow. Yeah, I needed that 80 times.
Yeah, very powerful.
Now, and I've never dug into this because every time I've started to pull these up, I think about all of the flaming hoops I have to jump through to get a company or a client I'm working for to let me install a package. Are these open to where you can just use the source code and bring it in, or is it, do you have them managed?
They're the only thing that's managed, and it's managed for a reason, and that is, let me show you here, is the Flow Actions base pack. Now, the Flow Actions base pack, it is available on App Exchange, an older version of it, so it has gone through the security review. You can still access all of the source code for the Flow Actions base pack, but the reason this is being released as a managed package is because it's given its own namespace, and it has a fair amount of Apex in it, especially where it comes to some of the actions that process metadata. that it doesn't hit your limits in your org. And that was the reason this was packaged as a managed package, was you could install it without having to worry about test classes passing in your org, specific to your org, and the fact that you're not going to hit any Apex limits by putting this in there. And the code that's in these base packs, they're just supporting actions for some of the other components. But you could still see all of the source for the non-namespaced versions of them. And you can install them individually if you need to. And it's available on App Exchange. But everything else is unmanaged and all source code's available.
Oh, okay. Thank you. That's fantastic. I've always been pointed there, but I've always given up early and often because I don't have the clout yet to convince clients to install packages.
It's a tricky thing, and I think one of the challenges with this is when Alex Edelstein from Salesforce, he's a VP at Salesforce. He started and really still maintains this site. I think one of the challenges is the name. By calling it unofficial. I mean, if he called it something else, Salesforce help site or something like, I mean, any other name but unofficial, I think it would have made it a little more palatable for some orgs and for some clients that look at that. So yeah, it is a bit of a challenge, but the thing here is it is source code. It's all unmanaged. I mean, you don't have to install it as a package. You can install the individual components just like you had created the source code yourself.
That's fantastic. Thank you. That was worth the price of admission right there.
So just, I'm not as familiar with Sockle. What, can you list an example of how you, the distinct functionality you just shared?
So when you have a pick list, you can, when you're going through records, you can repeatedly pick from a set of lists, from a list there. If you wanted to say, I want a drop-down list made up of all the topics people have submitted as cool things they want to talk about. And if they've repeated multiple ones, you would get the unique count and that would build your drop-down each time. You wouldn't have to feed that in or have that be a dependent object or a dependent field. You could just say, give me every unique item and make that be a choice for everybody from now forward that they have to use something that was already submitted here.
Oh, that's.
Yeah, no, my brain is breaking because that's.
That's super awesome.
Yeah, having a limit built in to kind of leverage off of my infinite records. That's the thing I hate about the infinite record pattern is if you select all the records, you're wasting memory by, if you're only processing 500 at a time, you're still selecting 50,000 of them or a large chunk. It'd be much nicer to be able to shape the query better. And I'm sure that that's out there, and I'm sure I could do it with Invocable Apex, but haven't had to do it, but feel bad about taking those resources. But if there's something out there, yeah, I'm gonna have to go cut my teeth on this.
This is a response I did a little while ago for somebody who had asked about that challenge of somebody saying, well, why I can't install anything from UnofficialSF, or I can't install anything that's in a package. And this is just another way I was just trying to frame what the code is and how it's presented and how it's used. So if anything like this might be helpful in having somebody in IT or somebody in security or somebody who's not fully aware of how things are developed for Salesforce, to help them understand where it's coming from. This type of explanation may or may not help.
Yeah, no, you clearly dealt with the same same question I'm asking before. Yeah, no, that's fantastic. Now that I could explain it, yeah, that's Didn't know that was a thing. Had not hopped in that many clicks. My, I'd been broken by pessimism.
You know, again, at least for me, it's one of those things of if I need to make Salesforce do something and I come up with a way to do it, I just put it out there, make it available and share it with others that maybe it'll help somebody else as well.
Yeah, that's a great philosophy. It makes me feel better if I'm doing repetitive work that I'm at least saving somebody else time. I hate doing things twice and I
me
hate
too.
doing lots of work and only getting to use it once.
Yeah. I'll take twice as much time to do something once, just knowing that if I had to do it again, I wouldn't have to do any more work.
Yep. The excessive laziness, the caffeinated laziness of the true developer.
Yep.
I don't want to do this again, so I'm going to make it take twice as long.
Yep. So I don't call myself a developer, but as you can see, I probably am one deep down. So
You say what?
I said I don't call myself a developer, but probably you can tell deep down I probably am one. So
It's those deep structures. You can't shake those off, even if you don't.
no.
Yeah, at this point, I refuse to install Visual Studio or VS Code. I can't do it. I will take 12 times as long, and my brain doesn't shut down. At the end of the day, it only shuts down when the project's done, when the code is compiling. So I have made the decision for the betterment of my pets and family that I'm not a dev. Cool. Anybody, any questions? Feels like did you have any more for us, Eric? I don't know.
Oh, I always have more, but
Okay. We're right. It's 8:30 your time. It's 7:30 ours. Yeah, if you've got something else you want to show, I'd love to see it. If anybody has any.
if there's something else that somebody's interested in. And that
We
I
have a
may-
hand raised.
Yes.
Says Samson, you still have a question?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Okay. Great. All right, well, maybe we'll call it a night for tonight. I think you've given, my brain is not going to be able to process anything else until I get to go select distinct and then flows and have that work. So.
Thank you, Eric.
You're welcome. Glad to share.
Yeah, big fan. I really appreciate you making the time for us, Eric.
That's amazing. Thank you so much.
No other questions before we lose? Did you have a question? No? Okay. Oh, great. Well, I'll save
right.
$1 on parking tonight. Thank you again, Eric, very much.
Good rest of your week, everybody.
Thank you.
Yep. Thanks, Eric. Thank you.